I cannot say in hindsight, like some Paralympians, I would do it all again. No, I wouldn't wish paralysis on anyone. But if it means I can be an ambassador for God, or the finest that he can be glorified in my life, or to ensure that in all things he can have the preeminence, then I would reply every time, not my will, but yours be done. Well, welcome to PEP Talk, the Persuasive Evangelism podcast from Solus. I'm Gavin Matthews, and in the other presenter's chair today we have Dr. Simon Wenham. Now, last time I saw Simon, he was leaving my house in Scotland to drive to England in the middle of a horrendous storm. Simon, I'm assuming that as you're on this call, that you managed to get through the storm and home safely.
Just about, thank you very much. Yeah, it was slightly vehicles blowing around a bit on the motorway, but yes, back safely, thank you.
Wonderful. Now, we started the show today with quite a stirring quote. And it comes from the autobiography of Kelvin Burke, entitled Lake of Tears. And I'm delighted that Kelvin is here with us today. Kelvin, how are you and where are you joining us from today?
I'm well, and thanks for having me on. And I'm joining you from sunny Isle of Wight, down in the south of England, just a little island off Southampton. So, nice to be here.
Now, that is not what I would expect to have as well. It was an archetypal Isle of Wight accent, is it? I think I could detect the melodious tones of Ulster. Tell us, how did you end up down in the English Channel?
Well, yeah, I ended up down in the Isle of Wight as I was appointed as lead chaplain of the hospital and the hospice down here on the Isle of Wight about 2010, that was. But it was a favourite place of ours for many years. We'd been coming down here as tourists. It was part of my journey of recovery from injuries that you referred to there. And we just fell in love with the island as somewhere to come as tourists. And then we started thinking, wonder, will we ever be able to live here or whatever? And it happened in a beautiful way. But yeah, we've got 3 girls who came with us as teenagers, and now they've grown up and they've got families of their own. And so we're all quite settled down here now, but the accent is still in there. I hope you can hear. Otherwise, my family over in Northern Ireland will be saying he's gone all swanky or whatever.
Absolutely. We can understand you very clearly. It's great to have you with us. You've obviously moved into a life of hospital chaplaincy work. It's an important part of the church's work, but it probably doesn't get as much attention as other areas. Could you say a little bit about how you went down that route rather than what we might consider more conventional forms of ministry?
It's an interesting one because I had a quite a serious car accident, which is what we've alluded to a couple of times. It was in 1979. I was young and sporty and 23 and healthy and well. And then I went off on a church trip to the Lake District, and cut a long story short, we were coming back from quite a long hike up Honister Pass, and the car went off the road up at a very steep incline, 1 and 3, and the car careered down a ravine and ended up on top of me and broke my back. And I was blue lighted to Whitehaven Hospital, and then after 6 days in intensive care there, I was flown to the spinal injuries unit in Wakefield, which is where I had started living as a trainee accountant. And I had a phobia about going back. That was an 8-month sort of gap in my life as far as Civvy Street was concerned. I had 8 months of rehabilitation. I never wanted to see the side of a hospital again. And even when I went up for training to Durham, I trained at St. John's Cranmer in Durham for the Church of England ministry. And I dreaded getting a placement. I knew that they were going to give you a placement, and chaplaincy was one of the possibilities, and I dreaded getting that chaplaincy placement. So even then, when I was training for ministry, I didn't want to have anything to do with hospitals. But over the course of my 8 months in hospital, I realized that part of the care I got from chaplains coming to visit me, just befriending me, and sometimes sharing communion, sometimes praying with me, but often just talking rubbish about yesterday's football scores and things like that. It just brought the whole world out there into my bedside, and I think subliminally it registered with me that these guys are doing holistic care and the spiritual care in a way that the rest of the medics aren't able to do it, just because of what their gifts were. And so, yeah, I ended up, when I went forward for ministry, my training vicar, Reverend Bill Henderson up in Wakefield, he suggested I go back and introduce myself to the hospital where I was actually a patient. And I had absolutely no desire to do it. And so I said, I'm not keen on that. And he said, well, go across the road to the hospice. So Wakefield Hospice was literally across the road from Pinderfield. And I introduced myself to them and just said, I'm a curate, very green. Is that, can you use me in any way? And they took me in for a year, just mentoring and sitting with people and talking rubbish about football scores and stuff. And you know, often the conversation does come around to, why are you doing this? And you know, do you really believe in God? And you know, sometimes they'll bring up big questions. So yeah, that was a long answer to a very short question. But I ended up across the road and visiting the hospital that I had been marooned in for 8 months, and the Lord brought some lovely healings through encounters that I had there. But
Most of my encounters with hospital chaplaincy have mostly been sort of more pastoral. You know, when I've been going into operations and someone has come round and has prayed with you, it's been really lovely when you're facing treatment to have pastoral care. And obviously, the hospital authorities would be against anything that they might deem as proselytizing. So my question is really, what extent can a hospital chaplain really share the gospel? To what extent can it be evangelistic rather than just the church caring for its own? What kind of opportunities and restrictions does a hospital or a hospice chaplain work under?
yeah, that's a very good point, because you have to recognize that you are working for a secular employer, the NHS, or in the hospice, it's the hospice is the employer, and their codes of contact will say that you don't proselytize, and so you take that on board. But part of my DNA is, back. Way back in the day, before I even went forward for ministry in the church, was to be involved in outreach and stuff like that. And so you can't take that out of the person. So it's part of who you are, because it's part of the gifting that God has given us. So, but it's not that you arrive at the bedside to visit somebody with that secret agenda. I wonder if I can persuade them to create a conversation about Jesus or whatever. So that's a no-go, and that would be an abuse of the privilege of being invited into their bedside, which is their personal space. So you have to respect that. But often particularly if you're visiting generically, saying you go round a ward, there's sort of six beds in that bay, and you go to bed A1 and you just say to that person, hi, my name's Kelvin. I'm the chaplain. Is it okay if I introduce myself? And usually the next sentence is, I'm not religious. That's nearly always the next sentence. And then you say, oh, well, is it okay if we have a chat? And then they allow you into their personal space. And you can't abuse that, because every person you visit in that situation is, by definition, a vulnerable adult. So if you then go along and say, I've got something you need to hear, then you're abusing your privilege of being invited into their space. But having said that, particularly if it's not just a one-off encounter, then the relationship builds up, and the person begins to trust that you're not that kind of person who's going to abuse that privilege that you have. And often they'll bring it round. The guy might say, yeah, I used to be a choir boy when I was a kid. And as a Christian, I think, we come to that encounter as a Christian. And so it's it's not proselytizing to say, "Oh, you're a choir boy. Tell me, how was that for you?" And you take the lead from them, and I think it's quite a good practice to listen, and also that whole thing of doing arrow prayers and asking the Lord just to give you the wisdom and the right way to react. Because if you turned everything, you'd sound like some kind of a comedian. If you ended up turning everything around to Jesus, everything they say, you ended up with the next sentence being about Jesus. But if you're very sensitive to hearing what they're giving you, such as he's telling you part of his early story was that he was a choir boy, then there might be something. My first thought would be that, he likes music. He might like hymns. That might come up again. So those things register with you, and as long as patient is driving the agenda, then I don't have a problem with that word proselytizing. To me, it's redundant if they're asking you about Jesus.
Thank you. And you've also mentioned that things like small acts of kindness, that's actually a large part of your role. Would you say those are sort of more significant than we might appreciate?
I do. I don't think it's just about hospitals as well. I just think generally we forget those small things do, particularly in early encounters with meeting people. So when I meet this person in bed 1A, I might notice that he's looking at me through glasses that are filthy just because nobody bothered to help him clean his glasses or whatever. So I used to carry a little box of a little spray thing with me in my back pocket, and it would be from opticians. And I just say, "Can I clean your glasses while I'm talking to you?" And so you just, it's distracting away from the fact that I'm talking to the vicar. The fact is, this man in front of me is doing something nice. He's cleaning my glasses. And then you have a little bit of a talk about how that went. And then you'll notice something like a child has drawn a card and is sitting on his bedside manner. And you'll say, "Oh, is that somebody? Is that family?" And you get an encounter then talking about the grandchild that did that, and you'll develop that into a conversation, or it could be something crazy. Like I remember a guy who I'm a Chelsea fan, so there's a confession. But it came up in the conversation that he was a Chelsea fan, and I just happened to have been to a cup final that weekend, and I'd brought back a Chelsea flag, and I said, "I've got something for you," and I was dashed off in my wheelchair down the lift into the office and brought him back up this Chelsea flag, and I put it on his bed. And that started a thing between me and this guy. He had multiple sclerosis, and he'd started that conversation with, "I'm not religious," and we just got to know each other and befriended each other. And he ended up saying, "When my time comes and when I'm deteriorating towards the end, would you come and sit with me?" And there was a beautiful encounter. I got to know his girlfriend, and I prayed for the Lord to come into his life towards the end, not just right at the end, but when he was quite lucid and with it, and he handed his life over to the Lord, and I'm sure that he's in glory now. But and that all started through a Chelsea flag. Would you believe it?
Yeah, well, Chelsea. I mean, that really adds new depth to the idea of treasure jars of clay, doesn't it? You Chelsea fandom to communicate the gospel. We hope that you are enjoying today's discussion about evangelism. But did you know that SOLAS also produces a wide range of digital resources to help you share the gospel in the online spaces you inhabit? Short reels, 1-minute shorts for Instagram and Snapchat, delivering the gospel helpfully and in tune with the way that people want to receive it today. 5-minute short answer videos, perfect for Facebook, and online blogs and church websites, and more. And it's all there for you to use at our website. Come and have a look at solas-cpc.org. And now, back to the program. When you look back over your many years of hospital chaplaincy work, what are some of the other highlights and joys, as well as challenges, that you look back on with most sort of fondness of that was really good to have been there at that moment? You've shared one with us in the last few moments. Are there any other particular things that you look back and say, "Oh, that was just a precious time to be with someone and present in their life at that moment.
Yeah. I mean, quite often some of the most precious ones come out of the feisty and difficult beginnings, and I don't know why it should be like that, but sometimes if you hang in there when somebody tells you to F off, which has happened, and which you should always, obey them if they do definitely want you to leave, but sometimes people are being feisty, and it's actually because of what they're going through themselves. They're actually using you as a safe way to let off steam and anger, even if it's directed at God. They can't be a God because I'm in here. And often those encounters end up in something where you learn to trust each other. I remember I'm a trainee. Well, I mentioned I was a trainee accountant, but so I am a chartered accountant by training. And I went to visit a businessman called Donald, and he was one of those guys that he got up and he dressed. It seemed like in a suit, but he was certainly dressed with a shirt and tie and jumper, sitting on his bed. Every time I saw him, he was like as if he was running the whole hospital from his bed. It's just to give you that kind of appearance. And so I introduced myself to Donald, and he said he was a CEO of a company, and I'd known from the staff giving me a heads up that he just had some bad news and that his prognosis wasn't good. He'd got a cancer which had returned, and his life was shortened by that. He was told he probably wouldn't see the next Christmas, which was probably 6 or 7 months ahead. And so I spoke to him, and I just said, Donald, how do you cope with that if I haven't been told something like that? And he says, I should be all right when I get to the other side. And I said, do you mind if I asked you where do you get that confidence from? He said, well, I've done nothing wrong. I've been quite benevolent. I've given plenty away. I've looked after my staff. And he started this list. And I said, that's fantastic. I said, do you mind if I tell you as a Christian how I think it works whenever we get to the other side? And he says, yeah, go on then. And I said, Donald, it's maybe shock you, but it's not about what you have done, but it's about what Christ has done for us. That's a Christian viewpoint. And he said, that's interesting. And then over the next 2-3 weeks of visits, he let me come alongside him and explain to him the story. Often through you have a little booklet, something like Journey into Life, and you would use that as a tool, and just to give him space really to take in what you've said. And I remember coming up to him one day, and he just said, and again in a very businesslike way, he said to me, I've said the prayer, and I feel safe now. And I wanted to correct him and say, actually, you feel saved. But I just thought it's a better way. He didn't have the jargon, and he made his peace with God just through taking time to read the things that give him and allowing me to pray with him towards the end of his commitment. And a beautiful thing then, just to share communion with him as his first communion. And yeah, that was a lovely story of Donald, somebody who really, I imagine he was quite a tough businessman, and but the Lord got through to him and won his heart. It was a lovely encounter.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I wondered, did you have any advice when it comes to, I think Christians obviously want to support people well, particularly when they're going through suffering, but there can be a tension of sort of knowing, for example, should we pray for healing? Should we say that to someone? And I know that's a particularly sensitive area for all kinds of reasons. I wondered if you had any advice on what we should say as Christians to those who are suffering.
Yeah, I think, again, you need to think in terms of who's driving the agenda here. So if you arrive with the agenda that this hospital should be empty because God could heal every person in here, I mean, logically, that's true. But if you go as a kind of part of your mission is to empty that hospital through healing prayer, then I would say, well, certainly the chaplaincy team would say to you, you're not welcome in our team. And people do go in like that. And quite often they'll springboard off somebody that they're visiting legitimately. So in other words, you're going to visit the person in bed A6, and you just catch the eye of the guy in bed A1, and you go over and you say to him, you need the Lord, and or whatever. That would be an abuse, again, of your visiting privilege of the person in bed A6. So I would say listen for what the Lord is saying to them, particularly if they have faith. So if they're saying, will you pray for my healing? Then honor that and be bold and pray. Maybe question for clarity, what do they mean? Do they mean healing in coping with the pain they're feeling? If it's like a cancer or something like that, where it would be a healing that would be a spectacular miracle that could be evidenced, then clarify that. And then just as brother and sister or two brothers to the Lord, just bring it to the Lord and be bold. Just imagine that you're entering the throne of grace at that point, and just saying, Lord, we're two people here, and we're bringing you this need. Will you meet it? And you don't have to fast forward and worry about how the answer is going to be, because you're meeting the pastoral need of that person who wanted you to pray for healing. But if, just to flip it around the other way, if you arrive there thinking, we could do some business on this cancer because, the Lord can do this, then you can do a lot of damage to the person who is the victim in some ways, because you've actually pounced on them and seen them as a way of maybe in some respects getting some glory for yourself as being the person who got rid of this cancer. Of course, it's all hypothetical, but it is important to be cautious there. And I've had a whole belly full of a year, of a lifetime of people trying to pray for healing for my own paralysis. I'm paralyzed. I'm sat talking to you. I'm in a wheelchair. And I must be the most prayed for person over the last 40 years. And, you mention it, Oral Roberts Prayer Towers and over in the West Coast and, in British Columbia and over in New York, and all these places that people were petitioned for prayer around the globe whenever Kelvin Burke was injured, because my mom was involved in the healing ministry when I was a kid, and became quite well known as somebody who traveled again in America and in Scandinavian Europe, even England. So she was known as somebody who would pray for the sick. And then suddenly her wee boy, was 23, by the way, but her wee boy was injured, and there was much petitioning of the heavenly realm for my healing, and I still will take a healing. If we can, if God can keep it on the agenda, I'd be very happy with that. But again, I've had a lot of people give me some amateurish counselling as to why it hasn't happened. It's usually because I've got sin in my life, or because I've got a grudge against the guy that was driving, or because I haven't got enough faith. But usually the finger's pointing at the person when you receive this amateur counselling, and it's quite destructive, and it damages the people. And let's face it, you as let's say you're the person praying for that person, you walk off into the sunset, and you've left the person in a heap, unhealed, at having to deal with the fact that you've gone off home to your family or wherever it is, and you can forget all about it. But the person that is dealing with the unresolved issue of why didn't it work is left in a heap. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's important to be cautious, I think, is a
Yes.
thing.
Yes. I think we've got time for one last question. What I wanted to ask you was, in the In a quote that we started the program with, you said, "I wouldn't wish paralysis on anyone, but if it means I can be an ambassador for God, then I would say not my will but yours be done." Has the fact that you go into the hospital as a fellow sufferer, you go into the ward in a wheelchair, open doors for the gospel for you?
Well, just to correct one thing there, I'm retired now. So when I was going into the hospital, it was a very strange thing. Often my chaplaincy colleagues would look at me and say, "You're lucky because you're arriving there in a wheelchair, and these people are seeing you as somebody that has empathy with them. It's just it's unspoken, but they assume an empathy because they assume you've been through stuff, and rarely would I refer to the fact that I've had a bit of a bashing on Honister Pass or whatever, but that phrase, it's an assumed empathy, is something that's just there, and it does help. The other thing that helps is when I arrive at the bedside, I'm eye to eye level with these people, whereas other chaplains and visitors, when they arrive, they're towering over the person. So then the person that's towering over them is thinking, should I sit down? And then if you sit down, then the person in the bed's thinking, oh dear, they're going to stay forever. So, you can't really win if you arrive there as an able-bodied person. But yeah, for me, it has helped with this, as I say, assumed empathy.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I like that point about eye to eye as well, because of course God is seeing us eye to eye on that level. Thank you so much for just sharing all that advice and encouragement. And by the way, you mentioned your story. If people are interested, there's a book, Lake of Tears. We've mentioned it, by Kelvin, Burke. I've read it. Very, very powerful reminder of just how God can work through challenging times. I also like the onus on Matthew 28:20, which is just the reminder of God being with us always through thick and thin. I think what struck me with this conversation is perhaps actually we don't talk about this enough in churches, but actually it's a completely normal part of life. And it reminded me a little of, we had Matthew Nearman on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he made the point that our population is simply getting older. So actually the church needs to think about how it engages better with the elderly. And I thought that actually had some overlap with what we're talking about here, even though obviously illness affects all ages. Solus is obviously about getting the gospel message outside the four walls of the church. But I think we can understandably be nervous about how we communicate with those in need, particularly in hospitals. I actually have a mother-in-law that I'm visiting in a facility, and it remains quite a challenging situation for the family, sort of what you say and do. So I've found your comments really, really helpful. So thank you for that. And finally, it also reminded me of C.S. Lewis's point about pain sometimes being God's megaphone. It's a way that he can sometimes get people's attention. Very challenging times can be, the only time some people think about reflecting on parts of their life, what happens after death, and reflecting on our past as well, the sort of good and bad aspects of it. So thank you so much just for helping us think over how we sort of carefully balance what we should and shouldn't say, being attentive to actually what God is wanting to do rather than what we perhaps think we might want to do in that situation. So yeah, thank you so much. So that's it for another episode. Thank you so much for listening, and do tune in again in the next fortnight for another inspiring guest on the PEP Talk, the Persuasive Evangelism podcast from Solus.